Today I'm taking a look at one of the best-selling mid-size luxury crossovers in America, the all-new 2022 Acura MDX. If you consider the Lexus RXL a different model, the MDX has actually managed to outsell the Lexus RX at least 1 month in 2021. And so far for the year, the MDX is absolutely killing it, beating the Mercedes-Benz GLE and the BMW X5 in the sales wars. I think it's easy to see why the MDX is selling so well. That's what this video is all about. And if you want a little bit more power, you should know that there is going to be an MDX Type S coming very, very soon. That's going to have the new 3-liter single-turbo engine out of the TLX Type S under this very same hood sometime a little bit later in 2021. Step one to making a luxury vehicle successful in America is making it look good, and I think that Acura has certainly hit the nail on the head with the new MDX. We have this very distinctive Acura grille, which is significantly better looking than the sort of beak-like or shield-like design that Acura had in their vehicles for a while. Now we have no more beaks, no more shields on anything in the lineup except for perhaps a little bit of a vestigial one in the Acura NSX. On each side we have full LED headlights. These are standard in all MDX models. One thing that the MDX and Acura generally has done very well is have a high level of standard equipment. So even though the base price of the MDX is pretty similar to the base price of a lot of the competition, you simply find more standard goodies on the MDX. You don't have to pay extra for this multi-module LED headlight or the LED turn signals or the LED accent strip, but the fog lights, you'll only find those on the A-Spec and Advanced trim. One of the other reasons I think the MDX has done so well is that it's right-sized. This is 3 inches wider than the Lexus RX, and you will notice that on the inside, but it's narrower than some of the German options, interestingly enough, like the BMW X5. That means that this is still really easy to park, but you have a roomier interior than you'll find in some of the two-row competition. Apart from the engine and literally a few nuts and bolts here and there, this MDX is a complete clean sheet redesign versus the previous generation. You'll really notice that if you look at the proportions. This has a much longer hood proportion. It's also squarer up front. That's to give this the illusion of a rear-wheel drive chassis. But if you look a little closer, you'll notice that the front wheels are still a little bit further away from the front bumper. The overhang is still just about as long as it was before. But Acura disguises it by really rounding out the front here in this direction, pushing the headlights back a little bit versus the front of the vehicle to give it this long hood rear-wheel drive proportion. It's possible that some of this room was needed for the upcoming 3-liter V6 turbo under the hood, but we also see the same sort of visual trickery in the Volvo XC90 that gives it a very similar presence. It's always struck me funny that really since the beginning of the Lexus RX and the Acura MDX that they have been natural competitors. Or I guess you might say unnatural competitors because they've always been two quite different vehicles. The MDX, a 3-row crossover, and the RX, a 2-row crossover. Until recently, Lexus cooked up the Lexus RXL because dealers and customers kept insisting that they wanted more of a direct competitor to the Acura MDX. But that's not what the RXL is, because even though it's just about 2.5 inches shorter than this, so definitely in the same size category, it has a whopping 14 inches less combined legroom than the MDX. The MDX's third row has never been enormous by any stretch, but it has always been completely functional and very pragmatic. And that's not really what we can say about the Lexus RXL. The RXL's third row is best left for people without legs, to be perfectly honest. There's just not a lot of room back there. At 198.4 inches long, the MDX plays in probably the most mixed segment in the US, because this has options like the Lexus RX, which is a 2-row vehicle, the Audi Q7, which is sort of the Audi minivan, the Volvo XC90, which is a little bit shorter than this, it's a 3-row vehicle, and the Cadillac XT6, just to name a few. Obviously, we also have the BMW X5, which has a small third row available, but not in every trim. Same thing applies to the Mercedes-Benz GLE. Out back, Acura has gone for a fairly elegant and restrained design. We have full LED taillamp modules, which is a nice touch. Not all the competition, for some reason, has complete LED modules in the rear, and we have amber turn signals, which are certainly my preference. Dual exhaust tips happen right down there, and you'll notice that this hatch has a bit of a raked design to it, but also does not stick out appreciably further than that bumper. So if I open this hatch or close the hatch, the actual end of the bumper is really only about 3/4 of an inch away from the metal. Acura bundles all versions of the MDX, including the base model, with more standard driver assistance tech than we find in any of the competition, with the exception of Lexus. Acura Watch is standard. That includes autonomous braking, forward collision warning, adaptive cruise control, their lane keeping and lane centering system, road departure mitigation, blind spot monitoring with rear cross traffic detection, and their traffic jam assistance system. By the end of 2021, the MDX will be available with 2 different engines under the hood, but unlike the European competition, neither of them is a 2-liter 4-cylinder turbo. The base engine is a naturally aspirated V6, producing 290 horsepower and 267 pound-feet of torque. It's mated to a standard 10-speed automatic transmission, your choice of front-wheel drive or all-wheel drive, and fuel economy will range between 21 and 22 miles per gallon. If 290 horsepower just isn't enough, then stay tuned because there will be the first ever MDX Type S coming later in calendar year 2021. It's going to use the same 3-liter turbo engine that we find in the TLX Type S, producing the same 355 horsepower. That's going to be notably more power than we find in the Audi Q7 with the 3-liter turbo or the XC90 T6 with its turbocharged and supercharged engine. Until I can get my hands on the MDX Type S, be sure and check out the TLX Type S review on the channel. It's going to have the same engine and same transmission, and the 2 vehicles are relatively closely related. So imagine the TLX Type S with a little bit of extra weight and a 3rd row, and that's probably what we're going to see in the MDX Type S. This MDX benefits from Acura's latest front seat design, and it's identical for the driver and front passenger, something that we haven't seen in Acura vehicles in the past. We have a 4-way adjustable lumbar support, electrically extendable thigh cushion, inflatable bolsters, tilt telescopic steering column, and a 3-position seat memory for the driver and the front passenger. So both of these seats have exactly the same feature set. A little bit later, the front seats will also be available with an active massage feature. Combined legroom figures in the MDX come in just over 109 inches. That definitely puts this ahead of a lot of the smaller 3-row crossovers and, again, miles ahead of the Lexus RXL. The 2nd-row seats slide forward and backward, and the MDX has a relatively innovative 2nd-row design here. We've only seen this in a few other vehicles outside Honda and Acura products. We have a removable 2nd-row middle seat. So if I pull the little tab there, I can just take this seat out. I can leave it in my garage when I don't need it and have captain's chairs, or I can pop it in the vehicle when I want a seat 7. You can also leave this seat in place, use it as a center armrest or as a center cup holder for the 2 outboard seating positions. But one thing that I really love is that this is standard on all trims of the MDX. A lot of the competition will become either a 6-seat or a 5-seat vehicle, even if you work your way on up to the very top end trims, but the MDX remains a 7-seat in all versions. Another handy touch here is that because of the width of the MDX, we have 3 sets of latch anchors. So this removable center seat has latch anchors of its very own. That's going to make this a lot more practical for folks that have child seats and they want to put a child seat right here in the center. Now it's time to try the mother-in-law row. You should know that the 2nd-row seats flip and fold forward like that, but you cannot leave a child seat latch anchored into place while that seat is doing that. That's because of the way that seat articulates. If you want to be able to do that, the only entry in this segment similarly priced to this is going to be the Infiniti QX60. The QX60 has a very roomy interior, but it's not quite as much fun to drive as the MDX. This outboard seat is now latched back into place. It's not quite all the way back in its tracks, but it is equal with this center seat right here, which does not move forward and rearward. I have maybe 1/4 inch of legroom left. My knees could be touching the seat back if I slouch a little bit, but this seat is definitely livable if I needed to for a while. My head's touching the ceiling. This is definitely a mother-in-law or naughty child 3rd row, but it is still much more usable than the one that we find in the Lexus RXL, and very similar to what we see in the Volvo XC90 or Cadillac XT6. You'll find a little bit more room back here than in the BMW or the Volvo, a little bit less than the Cadillac, the Lincoln, or the Land Rover, but honestly, this is one of the better arrangements as far as front row, 2nd row, and 3rd row room. Now, one thing that I find odd for a vehicle that has a relatively accommodating 3rd row is that there are no air vents back here, but we do have some cup holders and some USB charge ports on the side. Of course, the reality is that most people are likely to keep the 3rd row folded in the MDX most of the time. Most people that have 3-row crossovers in this size category keep these flopped down. We don't have power 3rd row seats, but they are pretty easy to access, and they're also fairly light. Adding powered 3rd row seats would have made the MDX more expensive, a little bit heavier, and honestly, I like a quick folding manual design just a little bit better. We have a pretty deep cargo well back here. You can see that I can carry a 22-inch roller bag in this position absolutely no problem. You can also flip them up like that and then line them up across the rear. We have 18.1 cubic feet of storage space behind the 3rd row, 48.4 behind the 2nd row seats. So another reason you might want to get the MDX over the RX is the cargo capacity. This is more than double what we find in the regular RX, actually quite a bit more than double what we find in the regular RX. If I move this bag out of the way, I can pull up the cargo load floor and put it on 2 different levels. That helps increase the cargo practicality. Also gives us a coverable storage area right there below. And then there is a spare tire under the vehicle. The spare tire is optional. If you get the base version of this, then you end up with a tire fix-a-flat kit. But if you get all-wheel drive, the spare tire is standard. In my exclusive trunk comfort index, I'm going to give this 9 out of 10 points. I do wish that we had some air vents back here for the 3rd row. It would help cool off the cabin a little bit faster and help keep those naughty children a little happier. But I love the size and the practicality of the cargo area. There's one additional touch over here which I appreciate. It's this little button so that way you can walk away and have the hatch close. So if you have a large or heavy item in here and you have the key in your pocket, you could just press that button right there, or say just press the button, throw the key out of the car, and then the hatch would close. I wonder where that key went. Maybe I should have paid attention. On the inside, we find the most premium interior that Acura has ever crafted. This model has the available upgraded leather upholstery. There's a lot of accent stitching and piping going on. These seats are both heated and ventilated for the driver and the front passenger. Moving on over to the doors, we have real wood trim at the top of the door. It's an open pore design, but it is used relatively sparingly in this interior, likely because of the lower price tag you find in this than in some of those more expensive European options where wood is just everywhere in the interior. There's a lot of stitched material and soft touch material going on the front doors, and that extends over to the dashboard as well. That's what the passenger seat memory controls look like. We then have a lot of piano black interior trim, basically just black plastic running right across the dashboard. Over here on the bulk of the dashboard, we find a small strip of real wood trim on top of that piano black trim, and then we find stitched goods above and below that on the interior. There's also another ambient light strip running right below that piano black trim. You can see all the stitched goods going down the dashboard. The glove compartment is a bin-style compartment. I was not able to fit a tablet computer inside. In the middle of the dashboard, we find a very large infotainment system. This is not a touchscreen system, and it's running Acura's latest software, which has been somewhat controversial. Not for the design of the software itself. As you can see, it does support smartphone integration there, and the software is pretty intuitive and easy to look at and figure out where you want to go. But the controller is not the most intuitive controller. It's down here in the center console. It's a touchpad controller, like we've seen in some Lexus models, with an important difference. Instead of using this like you do a computer trackpad where you simply scroll your finger along and move a cursor on a screen, if you put your finger over here on the upper left side of this, you'll notice it's choosing that option right there. If I put my finger on the lower right section, then the cursor goes to the corresponding lower right section of the display. It's definitely an easy concept to grasp. I just wish I could just stab the option on the display. We then have 2 large air vents right here, the controls for the 3-zone automatic climate control system, controls for the heated and ventilated front seats, and then a very large drive mode knob right here in the middle. This is something that we've seen in other Acura vehicles. It allows you to choose between snow, comfort, normal, and sport in this model. We then press the button in for individual. We have Acura's Hunt and Peck shifter here, power outlets right there, USB and USB-C, auto brake hold, auto start stop disable. The knob for the volume and power for the system is right here, and then track forward backward is a separate button. We have a large storage area right there, just a little bit too small for my large smartphone, but don't worry, there's a smartphone storage area right there with a Qi wireless charging mat, a little wrist rest on top, and then 2 very large cup holders. When you look at the center console, it's obvious that the MDX is wider than some of the competition. We have a wider and more comfortable center armrest. This is especially going to be important for 2 larger adults that might be wanting to sit up front next to one another. The storage compartment is not terribly large, however. That did surprise me because this is not a rear-wheel drive vehicle, so a lot of the storage space under there must not be used. This is a 2-tiered storage area, so if I press that little button right there, there is a second tier where you can keep pens, pencils, that sort of thing. On the driver's side, we find Acura's first full-color heads-up display. Don't worry, it is definitely crisp in person, but they're really tricky to film. And the first LCD cluster we've ever seen in an Acura. The display changes design a little bit based on the drive mode that you're in, but it's not as configurable as the LCDs that we find in modern Mercedes models. On the right side, we find a scrollable set of different displays here: navigation, tire pressure, super handling, all-wheel drive, G monitor, etc. The steering wheel is one of Acura's new round designs. It has a split bottom spoke, paddle shifters on the back, up on the right, down on the left. On the right side, we find the controls for the adaptive cruise control system, also a scroll wheel controller for that multifunction LCD. On this side, we find the controls for the infotainment system. The apps button brings up a menu inside the heads-up display. It's used for configuring that interface, and you use this controller to navigate around it once you're in that menu. As you'd expect out of a vehicle that got a little bit larger in this generation, the MDX got a little bit heavier. Even though we have the newer 10-speed automatic transmission from Acura, that doesn't compensate for the added curb weight, and this model went 0 to 60 in 7.2 seconds. That's now the official time for the MDX. The last time I drove the MDX, it was a pre-production model. I only had it for a very short amount of time, and I didn't 0 to 60 test it out on the usual test surface. That means that this is going to be slower than something like the Audi Q7 with the 3-liter turbo or the Volvo XC90 with the T6 engine under the hood, but this is going to be faster than the Lexus RX 350. Now, keep in mind that the MDX is considerably less expensive than most of those European options. So in reality, this is really good performance because something like the XC90 with the T5 engine is going to be slower than this, and the Audi Q7 with the 2-liter turbo is theoretically right around the same 0 to 60 time. The Europeans offer multiple different power levels, and soon Acura is going to be joining them with the upcoming MDX Type S. We don't have any details from Acura about 0 to 60 performance numbers just yet, but I guess, based on my experience in the TLX Type S, that it's probably going to be right around 5.5 seconds, perhaps a little bit quicker. In my 60 to 0 stopping test, this model took just 109 feet. That's thanks to the MDX getting seriously wide tires in this generation. All MDX models now get standard 255 width tires. These are pretty wide for a vehicle in this price category. The MDX also sees a pretty major change when it comes to the suspension design. Honda and Acura had been known for having excellent double wishbone suspension designs in the past, but the last generation of the MDX did not get a double wishbone suspension. The last actual generation of most of Acura's product line did not get a double wishbone. Instead, they went to a less expensive McPherson strut design. Double wishbones just do a better job of holding onto the road. They offer a more elegant combination of ride and handling ability, and I'm really glad that Acura went back to that design in the MDX. It's really noticeable if you're out on rougher paved roads because the front suspension and the rear suspension, they just coordinate better together in this generation than in the previous model. And then of course we get those wider tires and the latest version of Acura's super handling all-wheel drive system. This is one of the only vehicles in this segment to get a torque vectoring rear axle, and absolutely the only entry in this segment to get one at a price that's this low. Now the caveat, of course, with Acura's super handling all-wheel drive system is that when they say 70% of engine power can be sent to the rear axle, they don't mean all the time. They mean if you're really starting to push this harder and you're in tight corners on a relatively slow speed, so not on a track going 45 or 50 miles an hour full throttle, then theoretically about 70% of engine power in some situations can go to a single rear wheel. But any way you slice it, this is going to have a more dynamic feel than something like the Lexus RX or the Cadillac XT6. Now, some Cadillacs have what they're calling a twin clutch rear axle unit, which can behave somewhat like the super handling all-wheel drive system, but there's an important difference. The Cadillac system never overdrives the rear axle, and that's why General Motors steers away from calling that a torque vectoring system. This setup, however, drives the rear axle over 2% faster than the front axle, and that gives this the effect of having a rear power bias, or imitates it if you want to be truly technical. What's going on here is that by making that outside wheel in the corners spin faster than the front wheels, it can actually cause the vehicle to steer around the corner and give this a yaw motion that feels very predictable, very natural, and almost rear-wheel drive-like, but without the feeling that you're going to spin off into the trees if you push it too hard. The MDX is a really fun vehicle to drive hard up a hill. Now, when you start driving it down the hill, you're going to notice that this does have an awful lot of weight up front. The entire engine and transmission is either on top of the axle or in front of the front axle, so this has one of the front heaviest weight distributions in this segment. It is quite similar to the Cadillac XT6 and the Lexus RX, however. Now, in something like the Acura TLX, that could be a bit of a performance problem because it's competing in a segment full of really sporty rear-wheel drive options. But when we're talking about a 3-row luxury crossover, honestly, it doesn't make a difference because all of the options in this segment are relatively heavy. The MDX is relatively heavy as far as base options go, but again, keep in mind the price tag. So for a vehicle that is right in this under $70,000 price point, bear in mind that there aren't going to be too many exotic materials going on in the structure of the vehicles. This is not aluminum intensive or carbon fiber intensive, etc. So the curb weight of the MDX is a little bit higher than some of the European options. But on the other hand, this is going to be cheaper to repair because it's made of steel, and of course it's going to be cheaper to buy. Out on a rougher road like the one that I'm on here, the adaptive suspension in the MDX does a decent job of soaking up the larger and smaller imperfections on the road surface. But you'll certainly notice that Acura decided to turn the MDX into a more sporty crossover over the years than we see in the Lexus RX. So this is still going to be firmer, and you're going to feel more of those road imperfections in here than you would in the comparable Lexus RX. But I think that this is a better balance than the Lexus because the Lexus can feel a little bit too soft and a little bit too ponderous as a result of its suspension tuning. It's also worth noting that in this generation of the MDX, we have those double wishbone front suspension components, and that really puts this in a different handling category and ride control category, especially in broken pavement situations, than we find in something like that Lexus RX. In my cabin noise testing, I measured 71 decibels at 50 miles an hour, putting this right in the thick of things for this segment. The BMW X5 is strangely quiet. If you're looking for one of the quietest entries in this segment, that's certainly going to be that model. But depending on the road surface that you're on, this cabin could be quieter than some of the more natural competition, the Lexus RX or the Volvo XC90. Likely because of the MDX's curb weight and honestly the fun factor of the MDX, fuel economy has fallen a little bit behind the EPA score. I've been averaging just over 19 miles per gallon over a week of mixed driving. According to the EPA, this should be getting 21. Now, if you want the best fuel economy in this segment, oddly enough, that's going to be in the Volvo hybrid. It actually manages to beat the Lexus RX hybrid. But the Lexus RX 450 is going to get better fuel economy than any version of the MDX. And for some reason, Acura decided not to bring back the MDX Sport Hybrid. They haven't said whether a hybrid is in the future plans for the Acura brand or the MDX specifically, but at this point in time, there isn't that option. Bottom line, Acura has done a great job with the new MDX. The new suspension design and just the sportier character of the MDX is instantly noticeable if you drive this and the previous generation model. At the same time, Acura addressed two common complaints about the MDX over the last few years. The 9-speed automatic transmission is gone, and we're going to get a 3-liter turbocharged engine that's going to match the driving dynamics that we find in this model with a whole lot more oomph. Pricing for the MDX starts at $46,900, and if you get carried away with all the options at the moment, the highest you can get is about $61,150, plus of course dealer-installed accessories. Now, once the Type S comes online, then you can expect that price tag to expand by perhaps $5,000 or $10,000. Acura has not said anything about Type S pricing. That is purely a guess on my part at the moment. But the key thing to know about the MDX is that it is notably less expensive than pretty much all of the German options and incredibly competitive with vehicles like the RXL or something like the Infiniti QX60. It also is really not that much more than mainstream alternatives like a very top-end Kia Telluride or a very top-end Hyundai Palisade. With that out of the way, let's dive into the competition, and the first competitor has to be the Lexus RX. The RX is available as a 2-row vehicle, the RX, or a 3-row vehicle, the RXL. Lexus combines the sales figures for these two vehicles, and I wouldn't be surprised that if you split them apart, the MDX would actually beat the Lexus RX when it comes to the sales contest. It is absolutely a better 3-row vehicle. The Lexus RX can be a little bit less expensive at $45,220 for the 2-row model, but if you want 3 rows, you're ending up at $48,050 starting. There is a hybrid system available, and generally speaking, a few more luxury options available in the Lexus than we find in the Acura. I also like the wood trim in the Lexus a little bit more, but I think the rest of the interior design in the MDX is newer, fresher, feels more modern. The infotainment system is easier to use in the Acura than in the current Lexus RX as well. And it goes without saying that the 3rd row in the MDX is considerably more useful than the Lexus RXL. The 3rd row in the RX is incredibly tiny. If you put me in the front seat and me in the 2nd row seat, and my knees were touching the dashboard and touching the 1st row seat, it is not possible to put anyone behind me in the 3rd row. Even someone that had absolutely no legs, just chopped off right there below the thigh. It would not be possible to squeeze anybody back there. Theoretically, you could use that 3rd row if there are a lot of small people in the vehicle, but it is one of the smallest 3rd rows that's available. Even something like a Volkswagen Tiguan, its available 3rd row is bigger than the one that we find in the RXL. In reality, the big reason to buy the RXL over the regular RX is the cargo area in the back. It gets a much larger cargo area, but it's still smaller than the one that we find in the Acura. It also isn't quite as dynamic as the MDX. The MDX is more fun to drive thanks to its torque vectoring all-wheel drive system, and fuel economy is darn good unless you compare it to the RX hybrid. That is going to give you better fuel economy. Acura discontinued the MDX hybrid. They have not made any comment about a possible return of that model. I wouldn't be surprised if it happened at some point. We just don't have any details on it yet. The other thing to keep in mind is that the Lexus RX, although it starts a little bit less expensive, can get more expensive than the MDX. So I think as far as the deal goes, the MDX is quite simply a better deal. That moves me along to, I think, the next close competitor, the Infiniti QX60. The QX60 is skipping a model year. There was a 2020 QX60. We're now going to get a 2022 QX60, and we finally have some details on that model. But we don't know how much it's going to cost. The 2020 model started at $44,350. The 2022 is likely going to be a bit more. It's based very heavily on the Nissan Pathfinder, and it gets all the same updates that we find in the Pathfinder with a next generation of infotainment system in the dashboard. So this no longer has the two-screen infotainment system that we've found in previous generations of Infiniti products. Bear in mind that I have not driven the new QX60 just yet, but it's obvious that it's going to be more dynamic than the outgoing model. We're going to get a V6 engine under the hood, a 9-speed automatic transmission, no more CVT. It's based on the Nissan Pathfinder, which means it gets the improved driving dynamics that we find in that model as well. At this point, we don't know whether it will be available as a 6, 7, or perhaps an 8-passenger vehicle, because it is possible that they could end up giving us a 3-person bench in the middle and a 3-person bench in the back. The QX60 is definitely big enough for that. We just don't have any details on that just yet. Moving over to Europe, I think the most direct competitor to the MDX in terms of the nature of the vehicle is the Volvo XC90. It starts at $49,000, but will go up to considerably more than the MDX. It'll top out at around $86,000. And if you live outside the United States, you can actually get your XC90 up even higher. There was a version in the US that went over $100,000, but Volvo decided to kill that one off because it was relatively slow selling. The XC90 is really focused on interior refinement, Swedish design, materials quality, etc. So the leather quality, I think, is better on the inside. We get stitched leather on the dashboard. Everything is more consistent in terms of the fit and finish, the feel, the materials quality, etc. But you will certainly pay for that extra premium feel. Because if you want an XC90 that is comparably performing to the base MDX in terms of 0 to 60, you will have to spend a great deal more than $49,000. Generally speaking, feature for feature, the Volvo will be at least $10,000 more than the MDX. And the ultimate question here is, the XC90, I would say, is better, but is it $10,000 better? That's a bit more of a personal decision. Versus the previous generation MDX, the XC90 was the better handling vehicle, even though it doesn't have a torque vectoring axle in the rear. But a lot of the tricks that Volvo pulled out of their book to improve the XC90 in this generation, Acura has done with the MDX as well, with the new double wishbone front suspension, tweaking the design to give it a longer hood profile, a more elegant look as well. And then on top of that, we get the Acura super handling all-wheel drive system, and of course a naturally aspirated V6, which I have to say I do prefer over the less powerful turbo engines in this segment, but of course you can get the absolutely mind-blowing 400 horsepower XC90, which is one of the most unusual plug-in hybrids available in the United States. You can get torque steer and oversteer at the same time in that vehicle. It's an odd experience, but it is really, really quick and will get you nearly 30 miles per gallon. The downside, it's going to be pretty expensive. Also significantly more expensive would be any of the other options from Europe. The BMW X5, for instance, starts at $59,400. That is quite a bit more than the base MDX. Even though you get really, really good base performance in that BMW, the price difference is absolutely enormous. Bottom lining the MDX is honestly pretty easy. This is quite simply one of the best buys in this segment, under $55,000 to $60,000. And I think it's easy to see why I would argue that the MDX is actually the best-selling luxury crossover in this group, because Lexus is kind of cheating there with combining the RX and the RXL together sales-wise, and I would bet if you split them out, the MDX would actually be beating the Lexus RX. In a segment that is growing in popularity, sales of every model in this mid-size 3-row group or 2-row group are increasing year on year. The MDX is outpacing all of them, with sales up 126% versus 2020. And I think it's easy to see why. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below. Be sure and head over to the merch store if you want to buy shirts right like this one here. You can also find me over at facebook.com/AlexNautos, Instagram, all those other social places, and I'll see all of you later.